It was past midnight when the silence of the grand mansion was broken by the soft cries of a baby. The sound was gentle at first, but it grew louder, echoing down the marble hallways like a haunting song. Most nights, no one in that massive house heard those cries, not even the man who owned it. Richard Hale, the millionaire whose empire spanned across real estate and finance, had trained himself to tune out noises that weren't his problem. He lived in a world of deals and deadlines, not diapers and lullabies. But that night, something made him pause. He had just returned from a late dinner meeting, his tie loosened, his expensive watch catching the dim light. As he walked past the nursery door, he heard not just the baby's whimper, but another sound. A woman's gentle humming. Soft. Steady. Full of love. It was the nanny, Elena. Richard almost kept walking, but curiosity tugged at him. Quietly, he pushed the door open just enough to see inside. What he saw made him freeze in place. The crib stood in the corner, and beside it, on the hardwood floor, Elena sat cross-legged with the baby in her lap. She wasn't dressed in silk pajamas or wrapped in comfort, she wore a simple cotton dress, her long brown hair tied back loosely. The baby clung to her, tiny fists gripping her shirt, his sobs slowly fading as she rocked him gently. And when the baby finally drifted off, instead of placing him back in the crib, Elena laid him against her chest and slid down until she was lying on the floor herself, curled protectively around him like a shield. No pillow. No blanket. Just the cold floor. Richard's brow furrowed. There was an entire guest suite in the mansion with the softest beds money could buy. Yet here she was, a young woman who earned so little, sleeping on the hard floor just to comfort a child who wasn't even hers. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. For years, Richard had thought of nannies as just help. He had hired Elena out of necessity when his sister passed away, leaving behind the baby boy Richard had reluctantly taken in. Fatherhood wasn't in his plans. In fact, caring for anyone other than himself had never been in his plans. But as he stood there, staring at Elena on the floor, his heart tightened. This was love. This was sacrifice. This was what he had been missing his whole life. Richard couldn't sleep that night. He tossed in his king-sized bed, haunted by the image of the nanny curled up on the floor. He thought about how many nights she must have done this without anyone noticing. He thought about the way the baby clung to her, as if she were his entire world. And he realized, maybe she was. The next morning, Richard came down to breakfast earlier than usual. Elena was already there, holding the baby with one arm while she balanced a bottle in the other hand. She looked exhausted, her eyes ringed with fatigue, yet she still smiled at the child as though he were the greatest blessing on earth. "Why were you sleeping on the floor last night?" Richard's voice was low, but it startled her. Elena turned, her cheeks flushing. I didn't know you saw." The baby was fussy. "He wouldn't let me put him down. I didn't want him to cry alone." Richard frowned. "There's a bed. There's a rocking chair. Why not use those?" Her eyes softened. "Because sometimes babies don't need beds or chairs. They just need to feel that someone's there. Safe. Close. Loved." Her word struck him deeper than he cared to admit. Loved. That was a word Richard had built walls against. He thought love was a distraction, something that made people weak, something that slowed down ambition. But here was this woman, with no wealth, no power, no status, yet she carried a strength he couldn't comprehend. Days turned into weeks, and Richard began noticing Elena more closely. Not in the way men notice beauty, though she had that too, in a quiet, natural way, but in the way her presence seemed to transform the house. She hummed lullabies in Spanish, filling the empty halls with warmth. She cooked small meals not just for the baby, but for the staff too, saying, "Everyone deserves to be cared for." She even left encouraging notes in the kitchen, words like, "Thank you for all you do," tiny gestures that seemed insignificant but made the entire mansion feel alive. One afternoon, Richard came home early, something he never did. He found Elena in the garden, playing with the baby on a blanket. She had placed flowers around him, laughing as he tried to grab them with his chubby hands. Richard stood at a distance, watching a scene so simple yet so foreign to him. For the first time in years, he smiled without forcing it. But then came the day that changed everything. It was a stormy night. Thunder shook the sky, and rain pounded against the windows. The baby, terrified by the noise, cried endlessly. Richard went to check, only to find Elena again on the floor, holding the child tightly. This time, she was whispering through her own tears. "It's okay, little one. I've got you. I'll always have you." Richard's chest ached. He wanted to say something, but words failed. So instead, he sat down, right there on the floor beside her. Elena looked at him in shock, but he didn't explain. He simply reached out, letting the baby's tiny hand grasp his finger. And in that moment, the cries softened. For the first time, Richard wasn't just a millionaire, or a guardian on paper. He was part of that little circle of love. And it felt right. The next morning, Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. He called Elena into his study. "I saw how you care for him," he began, his voice steady. "Not as a job, but as if he were your own. No one has ever done that for me, or for him. I've been blind to it, but not anymore." Elena shifted nervously. "Mr. Hale, I don't do it for recognition. He just deserves love. Every child does." Richard nodded slowly. Then he stood, walked to the window, and took a deep breath. "You're right. And from today, I want to learn how to give that too. Not just provide money. Not just a roof. But love. Real love." Her eyes widened, tears brimming. She had seen powerful men before, but none willing to admit their own emptiness. In that moment, Richard wasn't the millionaire. He was just a man finally brave enough to open his heart. From then on, everything changed. Richard started spending time with the baby every evening. He learned how to feed him, how to rock him, even how to make silly faces that drew out giggles. At first, he felt awkward, but Elena's gentle encouragement guided him. Slowly, his stiff suits and business calls gave way to baby laughter and bedtime stories. And as he grew closer to the child, he also grew closer to Elena. Not through grand gestures, but through quiet moments, the way she reminded him to be patient, the way she laughed at the baby's every milestone, the way her kindness filled every crack in the mansion. One night, Richard found himself confessing something he had never said aloud. "I used to think wealth was everything," he said softly, watching the baby sleep. "But watching how you give so much without expecting anything, it made me realize I was the poorest man in this house." Elena looked at him, her eyes shining. "You're not poor anymore. You just opened your heart." Months passed, and soon the baby's first birthday arrived. Richard planned a small gathering, not the extravagant gala he would have once thrown, but an intimate celebration with only close friends, the staff, and Elena. He stood before them, holding his nephew in his arms, his voice thick with emotion. "I used to believe success was measured by numbers in a bank account," he said. "But this child, and this woman who showed me what true care looks like, they taught me that the greatest wealth is love. And for the first time in my life, I feel rich." Tears filled Elena's eyes. The room erupted in applause, but for Richard, the only thing that mattered was the way his nephew smiled and the way Elena's hand brushed against his, silently, gently, as if promising that none of them would ever be alone again. And so, the man who once thought love was weakness discovered that it was his greatest strength. A millionaire learned that money could buy comfort, but it could never replace the warmth of a heart that cared enough to sleep on the floor for a crying child. That single act of selflessness transformed an entire life. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments don't happen in boardrooms or on balance sheets. Sometimes, they happen on a nursery floor, in the quiet sacrifice of someone who loves without condition. And when Richard finally understood that, he was never the same again.